Good day to you all from New York. It feels like coming back home, since I worked at the United Nations in Vienna as a junior from 1986 to the early 90s. And I used to work there also in what used to be called the United Nations Fund for Drug Abuse Control, UNFDAG. So, you know, I'm at home. Now, coming to the topic of this very important conference, the issues of gender in sport are highly complex. And corruption? Well, sports and gender is even more complicated when we add to it corruption. And I shall be able to touch with you in about 10 minutes today only the tip of the iceberg. Let me first give you the context from which I approach the topic. The Department of Economic and Social Affairs, DESA, through its Division for Inclusive Social Development, DISD, that I lead, is the focal point for the whole UN system on youth, older persons, persons with disabilities, indigenous peoples, and family. And since about 2 years, it is also the focal point on the issue of sports for peace and development. Sports as defined by the Kazan Action Plan, that comprises sports for all, physical play, recreation, dance, organized sports, casual sports, competitive, traditional, and indigenous sports and games as well, in their diverse forms. And whenever I shall talk about sports and physical activities, today I'm referring to this definition. The Division for Inclusive Social Development, therefore, leads the preparation of the reports of the Secretary General on Sport for Peace and Development as requested by the General Assembly Resolution 7160 on sport as a means to promote education, health, development and peace. Sport is an equalizer. What matters is not the social class, financial status, and so on. What matters is the ability, talent, and passion. Sport is a driver for social change. So, why is there still this inequality? And why participation rates among women and girls are much lower than men's? I wonder if, for a greater change, we should focus on solely gender as a barrier to women and girls' participation in sport, or also on the barriers to participation in sport for women and girls with a disability or indigenous women. And then another question, does having a disability or being indigenous impact gender and create inequalities? As for corruption in sport, it has been admitted that it is nothing new. For example, the first documented case of corruption in international sports is attributed to the athlete Europoulos of Thessalia, who successfully bribed 3 of his competitors in the first combat tournament of the Olympic Games back in the 388 before Christ. Now, about the concept of corruption, well, corruption is interpreted differently from nation to nation and from continent to continent. Various types and forms exist, which needed to be analyzed in different ways. Another question I ask myself is, to which extent trends have affected sport in the 20th century? For example, sports from amatorial to professional, to the point that traditional sports is now a business worth millions of dollars, from amatorial to professional. A new trend is that more public funding is being directed into sport in the developed and developing world. Could it be that organized sport might have entered the trend of criminalization? Could it be that policies needed to address and deal with this kind of corruption that impact industries and markets that have historically been a private market? What are these markets when it comes to gender or persons with disabilities who enjoy sports and physical activities? For instance, in spite of women and girls being still affected by the predominant male-dominant culture on sport, we are noticing an unprecedented interest in women's sport. This will create some unforeseen challenges with possible unwanted consequences. Heightened risk of corruption. And what about athletes? not being paid or not being paid regularly in sports that are not under strict supervision but included in betting? Are these more vulnerable to match fixing? Is that corruption? However, not being an expert in corruption, I shall focus more on barriers that undermine sports' role in advancing gender equality. Barriers like social, economic, and environmental that, if removed, would encourage and enable women and girls to participate and reduce the possibility to be subject to corruptions need to be addressed. Barriers that stand in the way of women and girls' participation in sport are more numerous and complex than their gender. These barriers are found in all countries with different levels. They are not isolated to sport. What we are really talking is social inclusion and development globally, and the multiple discriminations that intersect for many women and girls, including gender, race, class, religion, ability, sexuality, etc. I would like to share with you what I have learned by talking to women and girls with disabilities and Indigenous women and girls on sports and physical activities. And I would like to share with you also what I learned by researching on this topic. So if we think of women and girls with disabilities in sports, women and girls with disabilities face double discrimination. Discrimination based on gender and discrimination based on disability. The limited available data suggests that economically, socially, and psychologically, women with disabilities fare considerably worse than either women or men who have no disability. Throughout history, disability has been closely linked with poverty, poor nutrition, inadequate health care, lack of opportunity for exercise and socialization, and stress. So getting interested and involved in sports is difficult for women and girls with disabilities because of the limited exposure they get to sports, especially when they're young. Those who became disabled during their adult life are many times more involved in athletics and are highly likely to remain active in sports. Women who participate in sport and who are also disabled are rarely mentioned in sports, particularly when it comes to sports psychology and sociology, and disability largely is ignored in textbooks and journals. So many athletes with disabilities of all kinds agree that sports are an important way to affirm their competence and worth. Sports sways the focus from people's disabilities and place attention on their abilities. Through sport, a person's skills and expertise is valued and significant. So what about Indigenous women in sports and games? Let me take the example of Australia. A combination of cultural beliefs and traditions, history, gendered factors, and geography is presented in Indigenous women's stories. Sport and physical activities provided the Indigenous women with opportunities to preserve their culture and to develop distinct identities as enablers. Furthermore, the women call for more culturally safe spaces to participate in activities, and for other Indigenous females to act as role models. Activities offered by local Indigenous organizations, government, sporting and community organizations who provide these conditions in their program design appear to facilitate Indigenous women's agency in overcoming entrenched social, historical, and health inequalities. The role of Indigenous women and the role in promoting their families into sport is a fascinating subject area and requires understanding of Indigenous culture, family, and networks, gender norms, and history. Now, what about other barriers? In the last part of this conversation, I shall briefly mention only a few other barriers for women and girls to practice sport and physical activities. To give an understanding of the multi-dimensions, we should consider to improve participation of women and girls in sport and physical activities by focusing on time. Time. Women tend to have less leisure time than men as they take on the greater burden of responsibility for housework, childcare, and care of elderly or infirm relatives. Money. Women tend to earn less than men for the same sport if done professionally. Transport. Lack of transport and accessible transport for persons with some form of temporary or permanent disability or disabling conditions is a particular problem for young women and youth and children, elderly women, women and girls with disabilities, and women and girls living in rural areas. Personal safety. Personal safety on the streets, on public transport, and in and around sports and community venues is a particular problem for women. Funding. At most levels, women's sport attracts less funding than men's. What about parents? The influence of parents, coaches, and other adults affects girls and boys differently. Adolescent female places greater emphasis on self-comparison and comments from adults than to adolescent males, who rely more on competitive outcomes as their basis for personal judgment and physical competence. And then male-dominant culture of sport. Some women and girls are turned off sport altogether because they see it as a male-dominant activity. It is just not seen as feminine or girly to be interested in sport, and for many girls, being sporty is felt to be at the odds with being feminine. And the very important role of media. In media, there is still female invisibility and lack of role models in sport. There is an imbalance in the media coverage of women's sport, as the focus is almost entirely men's sport. This is significant because the media plays a central role in informing our knowledge, opinions, and attitudes about women in sport, which in turn influence participation levels. So in conclusion, I suppose you agree with me that we just touched the tip of the iceberg. The Division for Inclusive Social Development in DESA would like to strengthen this collaboration with you all, making sure that no one is left behind, but what we leave behind is corruption. Thank you.